Salutare! Sunt Vitalie Sprânceană și vă invit la o nouă ediție a podcastului Platzforma. În emisiunea de astăzi vorbesc cu Sopo Japaridze, cercetătoare și președintă a Rețelei pentru Solidaritate, un sindicat independent al infirmierilor și îngrijitoarelor din Georgia. Sopo este organizatoare sindicală de mai bine de 10 ani. Ea scrie pentru diverse platforme online și face parte din colectiva care creează podcastul Reimagining Georgia sovietică. Ediția de astăzi este în limba engleză. Welcome to Platzforma, a podcast about politics, ideas, people, culture and activism. I'm your host, Vitalie Sprânceană, and today we will speak about the current situation in Georgia. On Saturday, October 26th, parliamentary elections were held in Georgia. The ruling party, the Georgian Dream, has won the elections, accumulating around 53-54% of the vote. The opposition claims that there has been massive fraud of the vote both before the elections and on the election day. Tens of thousands of Georgians gathered outside the parliament on Monday night, demanding the annulment of the parliamentary election, which, according to the president of the country, was rigged with the help of Russia. Here to talk about the situation in Georgia is Sopo Japaridze. Sopo is a researcher and the chair of Solidarity Network, an independent care workers union in Georgia. She has been a labor organizer for over a decade and researches and studies labor and social relations. She also writes for various publications and is also part of the collective that does the Reimagining Soviet Georgia podcast. Hi Sopo, thank you for accepting my invitation.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm happy to be here.
How is the mood in Tbilisi right now?
Well, I don't know everyone's mood. I can only judge right now through, my sort of bubble, my friends and family, and on Facebook and on Twitter. And I haven't had in-depth conversations with workers yet about this. I will soon. So the opposition's mood, including some of my family members, is depressed, very pessimistic. They, most of them, or a lot of them, feel like the elections were rigged. Some are upset that they may have voted for opposition, like this one particular guy, but they don't like where things are headed. A lot of criticism towards opposition from opposition people, saying that they didn't have a plan. They were just so confident they're winning. For Georgian Dream supporters and people who don't like the opposition, the mood is much more jubilant. So, but then I think like me and a few others who are, I would say, combating a lot of the disinformation opposition is spreading, and also trying to get a handle and following very closely the situation. I would say we are very worried still, because we don't know how this will develop, because it's right now coming to another kind of a head-on collision. If the Western governments don't recognize the elections, this will cause a huge crisis and a green light for the opposition. Opposition is buying time to be able to come up with a scheme to show that there was complete fraudulent, elections. They bought time with the whole Russia thing to be able to make a case. And so even if they do make a case, say it was rigged, right? And say they can actually prove everything, then what? What will happen?
For our conversation, I would like to, if you would agree with me, to downplay as much as possible these geopolitical arguments. I'm calling them vulgar geopolitics. I might be too harsh, but like this, I would also like to downplay this talk about civilizational choices. We've had that also in our elections. We have to choose between civilization and barbarity and so on. I see in the media a somewhat simplistic description of the events, which basically that picture is about Georgians that are clashing now, about the European dream being stolen from them, about this Russian influence, and I see the same frame being applied to the discussion in Moldova. And I see that it's first inaccurate, because it really does not describe what the real situation is. And if you take it seriously, in a way, the Georgia case, but also the Moldovan case, it looks also a bit absurd, as if you have several years ago Georgians were 2003, let's say, or in Moldova more recently, like in 2021, voting first massively for the EU, and now they're against the EU, and then again for the EU, and it's like a swing which doesn't totally describe the internal dynamics. But also I see this type of descriptions as problematic, because they obscure the struggles that we have to make in the public debate in our countries about social justice, labor rights, equality, prosperity for all, and so on and so forth. So instead of discussing these issues, you are kind of being forced to discuss about like the European values and the Russia, Putin argument, and so on and so forth. So for these reasons, I would like to focus our discussion on Georgian society and Georgian politics in order to understand its dynamics. And my first question would be really, I think that most of the Moldovan and probably other listeners too would not know very much about Georgia, except that like what they read occasionally about and during the elections. So like let's step back to set the stage for this Georgian Dream Party. Before that, Georgia was this kind of model of inspiration for everyone in the region. When Saakashvili came to power, what was this regime? The Saakashvili regime.
Yes, thank you for that nice introduction into why we should not always be forced to speak in liberal frameworks, which is very frustrating as well for me because I'm always forced to constantly speak in those terms. So the Saakashvili government came in early 2000s during the war on terror in the US. So they came in, and Saakashvili, as well as I think every single Georgian government, has always been very much tied to larger global events. So I don't think it's always like he decided these things. I think he saw what was able to be pushed and what kind of Western narrative he should join to be able to get the support he needed. So he very much so changed the flag to like a more Crusaders flag and sort of joined the war on terror. Sort of the Islam is the, we've been fighting off, Islam, Muslims for forever. And so he got a lot of neoconservative support in the US. He was able to establish, I think, a very authoritarian government, which completely reformed the police in the sense that they brought everyone new. There was no longer this sort of smaller levels of bribery. And then he had this like secret fund and extra legal, enforcement against businesses that didn't go his way, locked up a lot of people for petty crimes. And he, in a very sort of classic neoliberalism where you strengthen the financial and the military, he did all that. Instead of like stealing phones, now you can get a loan. At the same time, those who stole were all jailed. So kind of like primitive accumulation, reset of much more sort of heightened privatization and bringing market economy to Georgia, along with the aesthetic of neoliberalism with this sort of key buzzwords of transparency and so on. He completely got rid of the labor code, completely got rid of the occupational health and safety, labor inspection, like everything that had to do with any kind of institutional support for workers or even health and food safety. Things like, having businesses to be able to have some certain safety procedures, like not getting hepatitis C at the nail salon. These things, a lot of people actually did get hepatitis C at nail salons. So this complete deregulation, though in the beginning he was much more state-centered, like building a state, and he was looking at like Turkey, and he mentioned like Asian countries as well as a model. And then over time, through the opening up of sort of Poland and other countries joining EU, this path opened up. And one of the pathways to get in the EU and NATO was to support U.S. invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. And so Georgia sent in, I think they were like number 2 country with the most amount of troops to Iraq and Afghanistan at different times. So very much supported the invasion and so on as a way to be able to get into NATO and EU. Because that's exactly how also Poland and other countries were able to get into the EU. And so with this sort of larger play with EU and West, the West loved Saakashvili because he restarted the reforms that they were trying to get Shevardnadze to make, but Shevardnadze was not making to the same level. He was making, but just not at the pace that they wanted. So, of course, there's restructuring. They sold off all like hospitals, laid off people. Everybody over 40 years old was sort of, marginalized, and brought in this sort of cultural war kind of element to it where young people are the future and the old people, the Soviet mentality, they have to get rid of them. So a lot of the accumulated knowledge of the Soviet Union of professionals, people knew what to do, were completely gotten rid of. And so these new technocrats and so on took their place, and a lot of them came into universities and so on. And now we're seeing a lot of their influence now. And a lot of the NGOs were also created during this time and supported. So he also had the help of a lot of the NGOs. And so with this, astroturfed civil society, with the police force, and this good relations with the West, he was really untouchable for a long time. Let me give you an example. So most of the legal battles in court you would lose if there was any kind of labor dispute, because there was no laws, and the courts were like giving out 99.9% verdicts in the same way. They're very much controlled by one man. And workers, like say metro workers, once were like they wanted to strike, and they said that there were snipers on the roof, and they thought that they were going to kill them if they did strike, so they stopped any kind of labor dispute. And so there was like real fear that you really should not say much, even though at the same time he was also fueling some growth and so on. But then 2008 war happened, and all of the economy part like kind of faltered, and that he lost support after that. And then Bidzina Ivanishvili, the number one man they hate in Europe, now he all of a sudden he's a problem oligarch, right? Because he had the money, I think this is also really important, and there was already so many, let's say, human rights abuses and things like that piling up. And with the images, the videos taken from prisons where their prisoners, young men, were being raped and tortured. With this sort of combined effect, 2012, Georgian Dream was able to win against Saakashvili and take him out.
I remember these video leaks with people being abused in jail. It was horrible. I'd like to talk about Georgian Dream in 2012, in the beginnings or prior to that. How it appeared, how it was able to establish itself as the main opposition, how they managed to gather groups that were dissatisfied with the Saakashvili regime. I can use here, not in the way intended by Gramsci, but this term about historical bloc. It's like this thing where like various political groups, constituencies, classes, various ideologies, they intersect into kind of this political bloc to kind of win and exercise governance. So how Georgian Dream, in a way, how it appeared on the Georgian political scene and what it was in the beginning.
So it was all kinds of strange forces came together. Like there was no ideology behind them, except they were all somehow, abused by Saakashvili. And then a few that were just like opportunists saw that the winds were shaking a different way, But Bidzina Ivanishvili also had some kind of he also talked about social programs as well. Like one of the biggest things that he discussed was healthcare for all. That was a huge problem. That all the healthcare was privatized and people could not afford it. They were very sick population. So the biggest thing was he's going to give single payer, universal health coverage to people. And he also promised to open up factories and industry again, which he did not do very much. But he did do the healthcare, and then there was too large on the budget, and then he changed that too. So in the beginning, there was some social programs offered. At the same time, all disenfranchised people, and this idea that there were this not bloodthirsty government anymore. So Georgians, I do think I think people misunderstand a lot of Soviet Union, of course, and Georgia, is that Georgians are not used to level of violence. That is not something they do tolerate. Even the violence that happened in the Soviet Union was only 2 different times. And that was considered horrific. So we're not like some countries that are always used to violence all the time, and this is how things are done. It's just not true here. People really get upset over even the smallest things that are tolerated, even in the U.S. U.S. has a much more appetite and ability to handle violence, not just the ones they inflict on everyone else, but even domestically. Georgians are not like this. And so this kind of fear that sort of killing people like that Saakashvili did, and the imprisonment, these things were something that was very much not tolerated. And also like families of the people that were killed were also active in campaigning. And so with this very, eclectic, let's say, coalition, and a lot of supporters that were personally, even either they lost jobs because of Saakashvili or their business was being, robbed or whatever, kind of made this big, coalition. And also Bidzina had money. I mean, that's really important to be able to fund all this. And he had a good name because he was supporting a lot of these charity work before that. At some point, he was also supportive of Saakashvili. Almost everyone was at some point, because at the beginning, it was like a new, fresh, they all believed that everything would change now, because that's how they always do. Everything's like very idealistic. Everything is going to be saved by one election. And so when he came to power, people started filtering out, So it's like from the beginning till now, like Georgian Dream, how it was in 2012, is not the Georgian Dream that's in 2024, not the Georgian Dream in 2018, not the Georgian Dream in 2022, or say like about the sort of the change really happens around 2020 and 2022 because of pandemic, war in Ukraine, and so on. So this one thing that Georgian Dream did, so they did bring back labor code, very weak, but there was some, now we can sort of work on something. And then through in 2014, and then later on, this association agreement with Europe showed up. I think it was 2017, visa liberalization happened, where it's visa-free travel to Europe. And so everywhere it was like NATO and EU was like 24/7 everywhere. EU flags everywhere. We have downtown, you've seen it with like EU and NATO's giant office in the center. I mean, consistently being very pro-West, and I do believe they still are very pro-West. It's just that they're putting now in a situation where they're like first time confronting some things they never thought, like just hearing their talk, like I thought these people were my heroes kind of thing. It's like slowly like changing their mind. You could see them in live, like how their brains are changing because of the way the US and EU has intervened so much here. So like, again, very much like you don't have a lot of pro-Russian forces in Georgia. You just don't. I mean, it's like people want normal relations with Russians, but nobody likes Russians. Nobody's like, oh, yes, like, it's like, I mean, some do in the sense like, oh, they love the Soviet Union, if they confuse that with Russia, or they remember a harmonious time, or they remember, these kinds of things. But it's never like, oh, I really want to be in Russia's sphere of influence, and I really want to, like, be a colony of Russia or something. No, it's just very much like, why can't we just get along with everyone? And it's our neighbor, so we should not be constantly agitating them for no reason. So it's a much more practical way, pragmatic way of dealing with Russia. And they're always like, we'll take your money if you come here as a tourist. We'll take your money, But like, we're going to also be nice to you and have drink with you and so on. But nobody's like, oh, I want to be Russian. So I think with this sort of, ragtag team of coalition, people started leaving. Every year, some group or MPs left Georgian Dream. They brought in Salome Zurabishvili, who was the president of Georgia in 2018, who was an independent, like she was not part of Georgian Dream, but Georgian Dream literally forced us to like vote for her. Poured so much money into her. She's so unpopular, but they like poured so much money into her. And if you talk about like if the elections are rigged now, then her elections were also rigged. It's like they all, like this is the sort of, if we consider the kinds of elections that happen here, however you want to describe them, rigged or not, I mean, same thing that the president has also been, elected. And she, was supposed, I think they brought her in because she was a woman and they were trying to signal Western values and stuff. Like, oh, it's like a woman now. And she's French, she was born in France, like long history in France, French diplomat. So this like, maybe they thought she had connections with a lot of other diplomats, and then she would be this like very kind of diplomatic figure for Georgian Dream. I don't think that anyone expected that she would become part of the resistance against Georgian Dream, the leader of opposition, and totally using her connections to destabilize the government. So like I don't think anybody thought that in 2018. And so they were just doing everything the EU said and NATO said. They were just checking off lists, like, whatever they said, they did it. They sure, when it came to business interests, they always took the business side, but, they try to stretch the time and try to give the most lukewarm kind of reform instead of like a good one, So yeah, of course there was that. But then something happened in 2020 actually. So they had this, from us, I've been back in Georgia for 10 years. And from 10 years, I have been in almost every labor struggle and some social struggles. But lately, I have not been as active in a lot of these regional struggles that have happened. Usually, every single strike, we didn't win. It was it's like a really shitty victory, like 7% or 10%. The GTUC, the other trade union confederation that was handling almost all that, was about, the top win was 10% usually. And usually no one came, no cops came to beat you, nothing. They would just kind of let you wear yourself out and then declared victory, Until the metro strike and until we sort of pushed the independent trade unions much more militant struggles, and we refused to just go on having backroom talks because that's how other strikes were settled. We refused to do that. We were like, no, we're going to approach this in a trade union way. We started winning big. And while nothing was ever really done for workers in the past 8 years, in 2021, when the Garibashvili, this other prime minister, came back, there was, for me, a markedly different tone from him when it came to social issues. So before, it was we would write letters to the government of Georgia and they would never write us back. They didn't care, ever. This guy started responding to us. They would write back. We said we're really concerned about nurses. We had this campaign and they were we're going to work on this. Then first time ever, we don't have a minimum wage in Georgia. All of a sudden, he implements a minimum wage for healthcare workers. Then we write back that you left out, sanitary workers. Then they include the sanitary workers. So it's first time I'm kind of seeing that the government is responding to some of our demands. So I'm wow, that's different, At the same time, Georgian Dream is becoming more odious to liberals. So a market shift, we are starting to think he's actually thinking more and trying to do more for social demands we have. Yet he's becoming, they hate him. They say he's kind of backward and he's, whatever, anti-European. So all these kinds of more and more voices that they hate him the most. The prime minister that's more responsive to us. So I think that was the first time where what is happening? Some kind of from before where sort of liberals and socialists and labor can kind of coexist more or less, even though I didn't like them, and they probably didn't like me. Now it's becoming more we're going our separate ways because we don't feel like we should continuously criticize the government over things that they're not doing, Russian interference, Russian government. So I'm let's criticize them for not doing enough, not giving us a bigger, a better minimum wage, a living wage, these kinds of demands. And they want to criticize them for being Russian, somehow taking away democracy. They're raising hell about every small thing you can think of, we don't care. Most workers also don't care. And then 2022 happens, Putin invades Ukraine, and that's when really the foreign policy kind of shift happens where Georgian Dream clearly, there may be a lot of things that they do dishonest, but there seems to be a real fear that they're afraid to start, a war might start here. It does seem genuine. So they try to play neutral, they're okay, let's not get crazy. Let's not be like the Baltic states who are declaring, war on Russia every day and outdoing Ukraine in the hatred of Russia, and so this becomes a huge problem for the opposition, urban liberals, where they want to sort of virtue signal that we are 100% with Ukraine, and they're upset with the government for not doing enough and not being as militant and not condemning Russia every sentence. And this is where things start to sort of get really kind of bad. And then EU starts going sort of hawkish. Before, when they would tolerate certain neutrality, it seems like they're no longer tolerating it. They ban Russian television and Russian programs and Russian financing. They start to, make all these reports around Russian influence and Russian propaganda, disinformation, And so it becomes like, if you just say like US is an imperialist country, you are now spreading Russian disinformation. Like every basic thing now becomes Russian disinformation. It's like saying anything about the West is now Russian disinformation. So I didn't even know I was Russian until 2020. Like I was like, oh, I thought I was saying this my entire life growing up in the US. For 20 years, I'm an activist saying the same thing. And only like three or 4 years ago, all of a sudden I've been told that this is Russian information coming out of me, So like this is like crazy, because I laughed the first time because I was like, you people are nuts. Like this is the most stereotypical American leftist position ever. It's like it's actually quite American more than it's Russian. And then it's like people really take it seriously. They do actually believe in it. And of course, the U.S. Embassy was funding for years, a lot of stuff, propaganda, disinformation studies, and so on and so on. And how sort of plugging everything, how Europe is just good and better, and then everything else is bad. They're now financing anti-China stuff started happening. So it's like anti-China, Russia, and the West is giving out grants and money, and universities are giving money to only look for Russian capitalists being bad, Chinese capitalists being a problem. They're not giving out money to check on Swedish capital and how it's doing in Georgia, right? So this has also shifted a lot of the leftists into only focusing on Russia and China. So their own, because if you're only like, whatever the best and whatever you're researching, you're going to have more talking points and think it's worse than things you're not researching, you don't know a lot about, right? It's very obvious that you are switched over to thinking in a different kind of way, already predisposed sort of anti-China, anti-Russia, and that the Western is a nice civilization, like you said, and like
a lot of people are making various parallels between Moldova and Georgia, and some of the things that are happening now in Georgia that you're mentioning are also happening in Moldova. For example, the same kind of fighting against Russian propaganda. Also, there is a lot of resources allocated to that, and then at one point the Russian propaganda becomes synonymous with propaganda. Fighting propaganda means just fighting only the Russian propaganda, and there is all these people, organizations that are fighting that and completely oblivious about other narratives and forgetting to apply the same critical measures. Right now there is a narrative that puts Moldova and Georgia together, and like the narrative says like Moldova is ahead because we had this pro-EU referendum and whatever, but Georgia is kind of behind because the door has closed. I turn it to the opposite. And this is why I was kind of interested about the structure of Georgian Dream, because I think that like we have a very similar regime in Moldova that what Saakashvili had in Georgia. Like, of course, with the analogies having their limits, but in a way it's very similar. It's also very neoliberal, authoritarian in economic terms, liberal sometimes, or at least pretending in its kind of values, but also and I also in a way the same thing that you were mentioning about the social policy, it's totally missing, and I'm trying to imagine how the future kind of block that will sweep away this thing will look like. And to me, like, Georgia is in a way like things that will happen in Moldova to a large extent in the future. We've seen that also in Poland, this mixture of conservative values on the one, this emphasis on cultural conservative values, but then concessions in terms of social policies, concession to the workers, to the vulnerable. Of course, they are not huge gains or whatever, but they are concessions in comparison to the barbaric, I would say, cannibal capitalistic regime that we had before. And now, I would like to go in a way to the current situation, or like kind of current, because last year Georgia was also protesting in a way, and there was this thing that we translated one of your articles for our platform, the law on foreign agents, on NGOs, and you wrote a lot, and there have been a series of protests. How is the situation with that, and how this has affected groups and organizations like yours?
So last year this law was proposed, but then was removed, and then this year was reintroduced again. And then Georgia really had, I think, the biggest protests against this law. Though I would say the pro-family, anti-gay protests were just as big. So this was a huge thing because I think it also, because it was very personal for me, because it altered my relationship with the left in Georgia, because though, again, I don't like the formulation of this law, even though they removed agent, now it's like foreign influence, but I'm just like, I would have wanted to demand lobbyists and business to be included in such transparency and not just NGOs and media, So I would have wanted to be more expanded version and not just foreign finances, but also local businesses to show what they're getting money for, and media. So I would have asked for even more inclusive definition, while a lot of the Georgian left thought this entire thing should be completely removed and transparency was a false idea, not even listening to the court debates, like transparency for transparency's sake is somehow not a worthy endeavor. Like it has to have a purpose, they said. Transparency has to have a purpose. And also just straight up lying that NGOs are also already very transparent in Georgia. I'm like, this is just not true. Like no one can ask me to show them anything. I don't, that's just incorrect. So this, looking at being in the NGO world as well, because of our union, we have also gotten grants. We've also dealt with donors, right? We know how it works. Like the fact that you are monitored and they can remove your grant or not give you money if they don't like your politics. The fact that they're micromanaging you in a lot of ways, or if not micromanaging, what one of the donors did to us was kind of try to arm us into signing a statement against the law. When we said no, we became a huge problem for them, and they started making, we became their enemies, while they were able to strong arm all of the other recipients into signing, So it was like this crazy thing where all of a sudden, Rosa Luxemburg says, if you don't move, you don't notice your chains. So like, while we could have coexisted in this NGO world without seeing a lot of our chains, when things sort of, the shit hit the fan, all of a sudden we realized that these things were, these were chains on us. And if we did try to remove them, we were punished for it and ostracized and marginalized from the entire civil society. So, like, we've been saying this. I thought every leftist understood the critique that we've always known about foreign money and nonprofit industrial complex. I actually believed earnestly that everybody understood, we don't have many options. That's why we all get these grants, because we try to survive until we could do better, right? With union, I'm trying to do only dues paid unions and not grants. And until we got to that point, I was using grants to be able to never want to have grants again, I'm trying to do these things so I will never be ever, dependent on grants. And so I thought we all understood this. It came out that we don't all understand this, that this was somehow the worst thing that could have happened. And what I got the most in trouble for, that people wrote 30 articles about me. It was amazing. I wrote one article, and Georgian leftists have never been prolific. They don't really write a lot of articles. All of a sudden they were volume. I was I'm really happy to have influenced them to write more. I mean, I'm glad. I'd rather have these kinds of discussions than, telling me I'm a traitor Russian agent or whatever. So I said workers don't care about this law, and the fact that with our knowledge of what workers actually go through and all the union busting and all the problems we face as a union, this law is the 100th problem, like a 100th place of all the problems that unions face in Georgia. So to try to make this somehow a worker problem is dishonest. This is a middle class problem. It is not a worker problem. It is not a working poor problem, because a lot of workers are working poor, right? So for me, I look at it as a class dimension. The urban, English-speaking, skilled in sort of being being able to survive in neoliberalism, they felt attacked and they organized to defend their interests. And some of the leftists in that force wanted the support of workers as unions, as a whole, unified force. And they got angry when I said they didn't care, because for some reason we should have cared. The workers who don't even strike for their own benefits somehow should come out and defend some guy making 400 euros for speaking one time at an event, instead of that they make 400 euros maybe a month. I felt like this was for me, like kind of like disrespectful, like dishonest, because like despite the fact that like I'm very poor and precarious, and I depend on so many precarious jobs, and I'm actually dependent on translations from NGOs and stuff like that, which I don't have anymore, and so on. Like I personally definitely lost out by going against them, like my own money, like it affected me, but I still did it because it was the correct thing to do. And then two, I do feel embarrassed for getting 300 euros for spending 2 hours somewhere where the workers I represent make 300 euros a month. Like, I do feel like that's unfair. Like, I don't feel comfortable with that. It's like...
What you're saying was very important because, like, for me, it's also, I was imagining, like, what would sound this crisis or this situation also in Moldova, and like I was looking backward to see when like people from NGOs, for example, have showed any solidarity to the workers, so that now for them to expect solidarity back, there was like it's a different thing. There was not there. It's a huge problem in a way, and also, as you mentioned, it's like sometimes we don't discuss it in terms of labor relations. It's really a lot of precarity, but I think Bourdieu was saying that is the elite of the precarious class. It's kind of a different precarity than the worker that is like working poor because they have 3 jobs and they cannot even survive. You mentioning the civil society was very important because on the one hand, I don't know how to put it, the closeness of the civil society, of the so-called civil society, because I think there is still validity in like the term civil society beyond the NGO world, but there is like so much closeness between some NGOs and with the power, and through this, as in Moldova it happens, some NGOs are able to substitute the citizenry, the public participation, and they're very also convenient because sometimes instead of asking the citizens what is their opinion on that, the NGOs are being consulted, they're giving their expert opinion, and sometimes laws are being passed because they have had this kind of acceptance from some NGOs. And also what I really think, and I would totally agree with you, with on the law on foreign money, it's like it's disingenuous to apply it only to the NGOs when you have it not legalized in the lobby, in the kind of business sector. You have like really big, these large transnational corporations buying via business associations and so on, buying really influence, political power, and we have it here also in Moldova, and it's like you have this double language. If like anti-corruption is a huge thing, as it was during the Saakashvili regime. So you have it when like somebody bribes the doctor, which is also incorrect, but it's like this corruption. But when the government makes exception from various legislations and rules for companies, that's not called corruption. It's called like creating favorable conditions for the investors. Or sometimes when they're saying like, we'll weaken our labor code because this company requested that, and in order to attract more investors. How is this not corruption? How is this not influence? How is this should not be accountable? It should be. My question is like, what is at the stake in a way in the current situation, in the current protest? I don't know if today there are protests in Georgia. Like as you're saying, the situation is still unfolding. It's not clear. But what are your expectations? How do you see it? What are your scenarios? How it could develop?
So this law and the tens of thousands, some say 100,000 or whatever, came out to protest. A lot of them students, actually, sort of raised up in Misha's universities and so on. This gave, I would say, the opposition a lot of optimism that they could defeat Georgian Dream. I think they were misled. They misled themselves, I believe. And so then they took an anti-LGBT, the Georgian Dream also enacted anti-LGBT propaganda law, as in like outlawing propaganda. It's like the new conservative sort of language and so on. And so it seemed like, well, of course, a lot of people didn't protest that because the opposition would never want to be pro-gay because they know that Georgia is conservative. So they would never actually publicly state it. They were just trying to talk around it. But this really seemed to make EU and US very angry because it was about calling for, and we know there's no Russian-funded NGOs here. So if you do show the money, it was going to be like, Western foundations that are giving money. And the whole thing was, I believe they were going after the sort of top NGOs that kind of function as alternative states that compete with the state and compete with influence in global leadership. Not me. I don't believe they were coming after me. But, of course, I'm also registered, and I'm, part of the considered part of this civil society because we have grants from foreign government. So, this is, I believe, an unhealthy... the civil society is literally the arm of the West here to control anything the government does. This is a crazy thing to me. I'm starting to, I'm trying to get my head around it, but it's insane. You literally have this very confident, lawyer types who are mostly the civil society, who have tons of money and have free, entry into EU Parliament and all these politicians, and who can mobilize all of the media they control, which is 99% of media in Georgia is opposition media, right? So you have this kind of powerful middle class force that can destabilize your country anytime. It is kind of wild, right? I'm looking at this. So Georgian Dream is any attempt to even regulate it was no, they came down so hard. I had, because I'm a leftist, I'd only seen how US would destabilize leftist governments, right? I had never seen them try to destabilize a conservative government. It's like a pro-capitalist to these are not leftists. These are not revolutionaries. These are regular kind of businessmen, So I was really confused, wow, this is wild times, a different kind of a weird Cold War where it's about different capital fighting against each other, supposedly Russian or indigenous capital against the Western capital. And so they stopped our EU accession. They cut off millions of dollars funding. They are starting to look over their relationship, whatever bilateral relationship the US is. They sanctioned our politicians, banned them from the EU. The level of just, some guy said there were thousands of statements from, dozens, hundreds of politicians just condemning Georgian Dream. And I was this level of anger over an NGO law is crazy. And they were democracy has ended here. This is the end of it. So this kind of the environment where the elections took place. So they, of course, the OSCE monitors that came here, the international observers were 500 of them, who were already incredibly biased against Georgian Dream because they come from the same governments that have been condemning Georgian Dream, EU delegation, NATO delegation. They came here specifically trying to find any kind of violation they can use against Georgian Dream. They definitely were very biased, right? So you have this kind of observers, mostly their report focuses on the pre-election, which was the law that they hate, right? So it was already so biased, yet they couldn't find much on election day. And election day showed that Georgian Dream, despite the fact that they were saying that democracy is over and nobody likes these laws, it seemed like they had energized their base with these laws exactly. So a referendum on Georgian Dream was actually Georgian Dream winning. This, now 54%, was something that the opposition just, I think they had a heart attack, because they firmly believed. And I'm kind of shocked at how Georgian president is this naive or stupid or lying. She goes, but there were hundreds of thousands of people in the streets. Where did they go? She goes, did they disappear? How come they're not in the votes? And I'm just do you not get that that's not, whoever shows up is not the country? How do you not get that, That doesn't mean it's rigged. Those people did vote. They voted for you. She's not even running, but, the opposition she supports. It's just that that was not the popular will. Just because you can bring out people to protest does not mean that's what people want. How do you not know this as a politician of 30 years or something, right? So this is her main thing. Then she says, and this has been my friend said, they are all so extreme in their language that they have nowhere to escalate to. They're so extreme, they call everything Russian takeover. So when Russia ever does take us over, nobody will believe it. I think it's because they use it for everything, So she literally said, there's not even one trace of Russian interference. They were like, this is a Russian takeover. Acknowledging this, recognizing this election is like saying that Russia is allowed to enter our borders. It was this like really histrionic level discourse.
I can give you some Moldovan examples that are even more histrionic and even absurd, because we've had exactly the same rhetoric, and somehow if one of the candidates doesn't win, somehow we'll have Russian tanks. How these Russian tanks will appear out of nowhere, nobody can explain. Like, you have at least a common border with Russia. We don't have any border. So supposedly Russians will have to teleport these tanks somehow in Chisinau, and only what is stopping them is the vote. I'm really, in a way, shocked by the similarities. We have the same rhetoric. Russia is everywhere to blame, and then it's just being used as an argument in the same time as every kind of channel of even communication with Moldovan migrants in Russia is being shut down. There is no way to transfer money. There is no way to communicate directly. The Russian television and media have been banned, most of the time without a due judicial process. So everything is like kind of a never-ending struggle. Because we're kind of short in time, I would like to discuss now more, not about Georgia, but in a way about you and your struggles. What the current situation in a way represents for the left in Georgia and for leftists in Georgia. Was there a left alternative in a way during the elections? If not, how or what it could look like in some future?
Yeah. The left was already weak, but after the way things got polarized in the last year or two, I would say the left no longer exists. Most of them have joined sort of the liberals, like a left-wing version of the liberals, with the same geopolitical pro-West, pro-grants, pro-this, whatever, anti-GD, in ways of like democracy and stuff, like the criticism being around democracy a lot and so on. And also Palestine as another thing that came in, like none of the really Georgian left, very few people. I was actually shocked. It was mostly like a younger NGO kind of or queer crowd that came out for Palestine rallies. None of the left was really there. They also found, like, we went to the US Embassy to protest, and it was like 10 of us. It's like none of the left besides like this one person, two people, came out. Like, so it's very obvious that they are very complicit. They don't, because this pro-Western is good, discourse is so strong, they are not willing to criticize Western imperialism anymore. And they even say, like, we should have done more work around really just talking about Russia. Like, they came to the conclusion that after Russian invasion, that they didn't do enough trying to expose Russia for being the imperialists that they are. So I'm just like, okay, that was your entire, that was the conclusion you came to. And so with this orientation, I think and again, it's difficult. I also, I'm definitely very hurt at the kind of insane kind of insults they flung at me. But at the same time, I think they're confused, because I don't know how you could create a leftist force that's sort of independent and autonomous from a lot of the liberal grants and money, And you just had these sea of these protests against the NGO law. And so they would bring one poster, two posters for workers among US and NATO flags. And I think they thought that was somehow putting in a workers pro-socialist message, which I'm just like, that's not what you're doing, So I think that they are very much set that anything that deviates from a pro-Western point, this multipolar world kind of stuff, is horrible. That's just only going to bring terrible things and authoritarian dictatorship to Georgia. I think that's how they think. They mostly focus around sort of, thinking most of them don't have any working class base, I would say, very light. Some of them do, but in a very kind of superficial way or so. They've mostly been focusing a lot on these regional struggles around dam and forests and things like that, which actually in Georgia, these sort of environmental struggles often attracts anti-communist kind of liberal forces, because that's what it was in the late 80s. That's actually the green movement was kind of anti-communist communists to stop Soviet industrialization. So like it's in some ways a continuation of that kind of line, except now it's like Turkish company and Swedish company and Chinese company and so on. And a lot of the bigger infrastructure developments are Chinese here, despite the fact a lot of the horrific companies are actually American. But of course, those things are never put in like it's an American company. It's always, they only focus on it if it's like Chinese, like they never like say it's American. So I think that like for me, it's like the Serbia example has become really prominent, and like you could be pro UU and they will still fuck you over with the lithium stuff. So I don't know why they think just being pro-European EU would guarantee that these kinds of things they don't like would be more supported or something. I really don't know. And so they had like, it showed like there was this there was these protesters that were on a hunger strike in front of the parliament that were the people that were, their houses were destroyed by this mining company that's American mining company, American Ukrainian oligarch mining company, and they were in the parliament, in front of parliament for I don't know how many days, just like nobody cared about them. No one visited, not the government, not the opposition. They had these huge protests around them. It's like nobody even like acknowledged that they were starving there. I mean, it was just horrible, and these people then cried, it was horrible, and they left, after being ignored. And then they were saying, how can these people vote for Georgian Dream in that village? And I'm just like, did the opposition even say hi? Like, did anyone take their cause? It's like, blows. If they did vote for supposedly pro-West, I mean, how would you explain that's an American company then? If they're against government, but it was an American company that they were protecting, So it was like, they were just shocked by this. And what's really fundamental here is that they are so stuck in their worldview that they are really unable to see how they are not popular, or how their worldview is not compelling or attractive for a lot of people. And at the same time, of course, at least the Georgian left, stops the liberals and does get angry when they mock the backwardness of rural people, and they will mock them for being unhygienic, listening to Russian music, eating like Soviet foods. They're really fucking horrible the way they talk about poor people and rural people and old people. My God, now it's been a war on old people. They just hate them now because they think they're the reason they lost their European future, So the severe generational, cultural, and age war that's happening, at least the left wing, the 100 people or so will push back against the mischaracterization and the horrible slander of older people and rural people. At least, thank God, they haven't lost that part. But at the same time, they are unwilling to break out of any of their fundamental framework. Even the way they try to talk about workers is like, oh, the biggest problem is if you get into EU, then you'll just get minimum wage and all of a sudden everything will be fine. You know what I mean? Like, that's also so dishonest. So they actually get mad at me for saying, this is the crazy part. I said, I don't care if we get into EU or not. I think we should organize ourselves. Like, we should strengthen our own institutions. We should know what we want. And they were like, no. It's like, that can't happen. Like, you have to be either pro-Russian or like, you cannot have an independent politics. You cannot fight for workers' interests without putting some kind of a EU flag over it, or somehow falling into some kind of Russian thing. It's a really weird thing to me. What I say, I find so rational and normal to say we should build our own country, and whatever comes. We can't control the other stuff, and we have no sway with liberals. So why even waste your time? I don't get it. You are nobody there. They're stronger than you. They dominate every narrative. Why? You just give them a good face and fool workers into thinking they care about them, So why don't we figure out how to build our own money, our own institutions, our own politics that doesn't fall into this like pro-West or pro-Russia camp? And I think that will be the most difficult. There was one party in the coalition that was signaling like they were more social democratic. Former Georgian Dream prime minister and former members of parliament were trying to create this bloc. I mean, they suck. They don't know anything. They were trying to ask some of my friends to write their program. I mean, it was so clear they were just trying to find a place within the spectrum. They're very superficial, mostly liberal, and they're doing everything else. They were like liking the posts of U.S. embassy interfering in our elections. The number 3 on the list was liking the post where the U.S. embassy was threatening that we'd be isolated if we didn't vote the correct way. I mean, so how do you even take these people seriously? You know what I mean? Like, they're literally for pro-U.S. intervention. Like, how can you say you love our country, like, when you believe that you should have? I think, like, if we just said, like, hey, we're just going to be Germany's, like, another, you know, colony, and they could just completely administer the entire country with Germans, I think the people would, like, half the country, or the liberals would be excited about this prospect, you know? It's just like, that's just crazy. I don't want to live in a world like that, you know?
I wanted to end this conversation away on a very positive note, and I like very much that idea of yours about your, like, building your own money, own institutions, own politics. I think and I see that we're lacking it too here. I'm puzzled, and I'm like about how many parallels are between our situations, and I think that kind of begs the kind of the question for the necessity of a further dialogue, of a kind of more constant and frequent conversations, because in many ways we're having similar issues, kind of being forced to discuss them with the same kind of false weapons, or that don't help us advance and our causes, and I think we're now in an existential kind of struggle also to find this path of our own money, own institutions, own politics, because I think rebuilding, having strong institutions, having workers organized, it's like really it's now, how to put it, so it's of foremost importance for any leftist movement, and I think this is our primordial kind of struggle, and not to engage in these false narratives about EU and Russia that lives, they go nowhere and they lead nowhere, because there is nothing there. They're just empty zombie categories that we're trying to use. And in Moldova, what I see is like really, even that small liberal facade that we had about like liberal democracy, right now is being burned, and is being burned by the same people that kind of helped erected it, like the so-called civil society, the so-called independent media. Like, we have the same kind of witch hunting on elderly, on the ethnic minorities. Yeah, it's kind of sad, but then there is this beacon of hope in a way, and there is this, it sounds like a program. It's not very kind of, it's not big utopia, but I think like right now maybe we're in this situation where we have to rebuild the movements, the institutions. Thank you very much, Sopo, for this very enlightening for me, and I hope for our listeners, conversation. And I hope to have this similar conversation or another conversation very soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.